Here we are for week 7, which means we're halfway through at the end of this class. We're halfway through the class. Week 7 of the Vikings, and tonight our topic is Viking Sagas, but I've done something a little bit different. When I first started preparing this lecture, I was going to have Viking Sagas 1 and Viking Sagas 2, and it turned out to be a little bit different when I actually got done with it all. And so I'm going to go through the lecture on Viking Sagas 1, and it's posted on the web CT as Viking Sagas 1. And about halfway through, I'm going to tell you the story of one of the sagas in great detail. And what that is Viking Sagas 2, so that you don't have to sit here and take notes like crazy, because you can go and download this whole story. And I'll tell it to you. I'll read you my notes and sort of expand and tell you the story. But the notes are on the web CT, so that you can get it from there. And so I expect we'll get about halfway through here, and then we'll take a break in the middle, and then I don't know exactly where that'll happen. And then we'll pick up the lecture in the middle after the break. So that's just the way this one turned out. We have to sort of be ready to innovate here. So we're going to do sagas, and one of the most interesting things about the Vikings, I think, are the sagas. They're very interesting. They're fun reading. Although I don't know why this particular class didn't enjoy reading Egil's saga for some reason that I don't understand, but I hope you'll like the one I'm going to tell you today. Anyway, I want to mention one more thing before we go on, and that is your paper proposals, which are due really the end of this week. And so your date is on the calendar on the website, so that you can look for the date that they're due. And we want you can turn them in person, those of you who are in class tonight. Those of you who are off campus, and I'll check in with Sugar Land and West Houston in a moment, but if you're off campus, you can email them, and we'd like you to email them to our TA or to me, either one, as a Word document, okay? Attach it as a Word document or as a text file. We can open it as a text file. Yeah.
And make sure that you email it to the addresses on the syllabus. Email it to the TA at the address on the syllabus. Don't try to email on the web CT.
Okay, yeah. What happened when we do have some people who tried to email it to the web CT, and it ended up being on the discussion board for everybody in the class to see. And I don't think that's really a good idea, although it's interesting to see what other people are doing in their proposals. I think that probably you don't want to do that. There is a discussion page on the web CT, so that if you have any comments you want to make, and we might post some questions to discuss on there as well. If you have any comments to make about the course, or about questions that you might have, or anything you found that you think is of interest and you want to discuss it with other students, you can post it on the discussion board, and then other students can check that board and make their own comments. And we were sort of talking before class, and we have one student here who was looking at Viking. What does it mean to go Viking? And he found all kinds of interesting things, and so, you know, you might want to share some of that on the discussion board and see what people say, because nobody has actually done anything on the discussion board yet, as I checked it before class. Okay, let's check with West Houston. I think I see somebody at West Houston. How many are out there? Nobody at West Houston? Or do we just not have voice? Oh, okay. How about Sugar Land? Anybody there?
Got 4 out here.
Oh, 4 out there. Good. The faithful ones. Now I see you all, that we have a close-up there. Good for you. Okay, do any of you in Sugar Land have any questions about your paper proposals? No questions? It's all clear? Okay, great. Then we'll go ahead with...
Comment? Hello?
Yes.
I have a comment that I'm coming across all the same material time and time again. All the books have the same material. I'm just worried about not having enough material for 10 pages worth of text.
Oh, okay. You're finding the same material. What topic are you working on?
King Canute.
Oh, King Canute. Okay, I know why you're coming across the same material, because there are very limited sources for King Canute, and they all are about the same. That's why you're coming on to the same thing. If you want to do some more original research on King Canute, you might get the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is one of your optional books, and kind of read around King Canute and see what he's doing different from what the earlier English kings did, and maybe see what the later English kings did, and try to extend your study that way. It doesn't surprise me that you're coming across a lot of the same things in a lot of different books. Okay, so what you need to do is kind of go outside the box and ask some new questions that other people haven't asked, and see if you can track down some interesting things in the sources on your own, or maybe reason the interpretation a little differently than you see people doing in those books. Okay? Does that help you a little bit?
Yeah, that helps a little bit. Thanks.
Okay, good. Okay, and you need to email your papers in by Friday. Okay. All right, and as we said before, email them either to the TA or to me with the email addresses on the syllabus, and not to the WebCT site, because we haven't figured out how to do that yet. We have figured out how to do the midterm. Now, Libby, the midterm, we're going to post the midterm on Friday the 7th, is that right? Okay, we'll probably write the midterm this week, and then we'll post it on Friday the 7th. And then it's a take-home midterm. You need to answer the questions, and there will be parameters and guidelines. For example, on your identifications, we only want you to write about 1/3 of a page. Just because it's a take-home, that doesn't mean you can you can write prolifically anything that comes into your mind. Your time and space is limited, so 1/3 of a page for each identification. It can be single-spaced, but typewritten on a Word document page, 1/3 of a page. And what is the limit on the essay, or what limit are we going to have? 6 pages for the essay, double-spaced. 6 pages, double-spaced. Normal type, okay, nothing below 10-point type. Normal margins, okay. No squeezing out the margins. Any other comments?
About the due date for the midterm.
Yeah.
I had the 11th down, but it actually is going to be the 14th if we're posting it on the 7th.
Right,
The due date
right.
will be the 14th.
We'll make it March 14th, just so that we have the same due date for the in-class people and the people watching it on KUHT. And that'll make it easier for everyone, I think, if we make it. So it'll be posted March 7th, and, well, this semester for this class. It'll be posted this Friday, and then it'll be due, or not this Friday, a week from this Friday. And then it'll be due a week after it's posted, okay? All right. Now, obviously, in the future, the dates will be different. So check on the website. We'll have the correct date on the website. I'm sorry to confuse you, but this class will be given over again, and the dates will be different. Okay, now let's get to the sagas. And I think sagas are fun. I love sagas. I don't know why you hated Ale Saga. Maybe we can talk about that tonight. Did all of you where do we have the 4 people in Sugarland?
Yes, that's where we are.
Okay. Did you like Ale Saga, or did you dislike it?
Well, I didn't dislike it, but I think that I've had other books that I prefer more than Ale Saga.
Okay. Anybody else in Sugarland have a comment on Ale Saga? Well, maybe you'll like the one today. We'll see. Okay. Sagas are original Viking literature. There's nothing like the sagas anywhere else in Europe, but we're going to see that they're kind of related to other European literature in surprising ways. They're quite distinctive. Nobody else wrote literature quite like the sagas. And apparently they were all originally oral. And so there are historical aspects about the sagas that they sort of incorporated elements from the periods in which they were originally composed, and then they're repeated over and over again, sometimes for centuries, and those historical elements are still in there. And they start out as oral documents, and you know what happens to oral documents. Have we ever played this game called, I think it's called Telegram or something, and you have a line of people and the first person whispers a message into the ear of the one next to them, and they whisper it all down the line until you get to the end, and it's utterly different when you get to the end. So that's kind of what happens to oral documents sometimes. So they're a little bit untrustworthy when they're not handed down in a written form, when they're handed down in an oral form. And so the big question has always been, can we treat them in any way historically? And the answer has largely been, about half the people say yes and half the people say no. Some of them are as old as maybe the 9th century, because the subject matter they treat is as old as the 9th century, but they were written down largely in the 12th and 13th centuries, so you can see they had lots of time to be altered according to the needs of people in the different generations who repeated them. They might have been a response to the 12th century Renaissance in Northern Europe, because one of the things that happened in the 12th century Renaissance was there was a big boom in history writing. You have historical writing really bursting forth in the 12th century, especially in England, and less so on the continent. And so that's an interesting thing, because we do have that heavy Viking influence in England that we're going to see. And the fact that there's a lot of historical writing in England, it might be a response to the Norman conquest. That's one possible cause that's often given. Also, the First Crusade is 1095, and you just have a huge number of histories written about the First Crusade. So there's another explosion of histories. 1095 is the First Crusade, but there's just this explosion in history writing in the 12th century Renaissance, a searching of the past, and in some cases a reworking of the past, which is quite interesting, that in some ways history is rewritten when it's written down, and the past is reinterpreted. So that some authors have said the Vikings are searching the past in a parallel way to what's going on in the continent, but instead of writing what they portray as histories in the ways that the Greeks and Romans wrote histories, they're writing sagas. And sagas are usually taken as a literary form. And they do have a special pattern that they follow that is the saga form. They're largely Icelandic, and most of them are written in Iceland, and so this also makes people think they're untrustworthy, because the Icelanders are kind of isolated from the rest of Europe and what's going on there. So as we look at these sagas, we'll see if we can treat them in any way as historical documents. One of the sagas I'm going to focus on today in great detail is the Volsunga saga, which is the Song of the Volsungs, and it is a family history. The Volsungs are a family named after one of the ancestors whose first name was Volsung, King Volsung. And then it's actually his grandson who is Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. And so it's the Norse epic of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. It's written down by that famous author Anonymous in the 13th century in Iceland, and most of the sagas are written by anonymous, as are a lot of other things in the Middle Ages. Sources may have included a lost earlier prose saga that was written down, or it might have been repeated as a piece of oral literature. Okay, here is a picture of the written sagas, and these are facsimiles of Old Norse manuscripts. This is the Nitlinga saga, and here is the Landnámabók, which is the Land Settlement Book of Iceland, and here is Vigastyr's saga. Can you recognize any of the words in any of these sagas, just out of interest? You see if there are any words that you might recognize. It's written in Old Norse, Old Icelandic. Okay, I should have picked some out earlier. This looks like it says Thorgils, the name Thorgil, because there's that PH, that P sign that's a TH. Can you see that? And over it is a line drawn, and when there's a line drawn over something, it means that a letter is left out, and that's how medieval scribes wrote their manuscripts. They would draw a line. That's the origin of French and Italian and Spanish accents. If you put a little symbol over it, it means something's left out. Okay. Well, probably we're not going to find any others that we can recognize. We might, sometimes words will pop out at you and sometimes they won't. All right. The Volsung sagas, or the Volsunga saga, recounts runic knowledge, princely jealousies, betrayals, unrequited love, the vengeance of a barbarian queen, the greedy schemes of Attila the Hun. Isn't that surprising that Attila the Hun appears in this saga? Also, the mythic deeds of the dragon slayer Sigurd the Volsung. And it describes events from the ancient wars among the kings of the Burgundians, the Huns, and the Goths. Okay, so really it goes back to a historical period that might be somewhere in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, probably the 5th century in Europe. It alludes to actual historical characters. The story itself is similar to the Germanic Nibelungenlied, and Sigurd is in the Nibelungenlied. Sigurd is Siegfried in that German epic. Sigurd acquires the Rheingold and becomes tragically entangled in a love triangle. The supernatural woman who is in it is a Valkyrie, one of Odin's warrior maidens, and so it's mixing a lot of myth and a lot of imagination and a lot of supernatural things with some actual historical people and events. Okay. And here is Sigurd, the Dragon Slayer. And one reason I picked this particular saga is I found loads of pictures to go with it, because the Volsung saga was so popular that Sigurd is pictured everywhere, and scenes from this are pictured all over in the Scandinavian world. And this is a Christian chair in a church in Norway. And here is Sigurd the Dragon Slayer killing the dragon on the back of this chair. Okay. And here we can refresh our memory about the Germanic tribes as they came into Europe. If we go back to Jordanus, which is now being treated as a good historical text, they all came actually from Scandinavia. The Angles and the Saxons came from Jutland here, and then the others came, the Burgundians and the Lombards and the Goths and the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths came down, and this is an older map sort of tracing their journeys all over Europe. They wandered around for quite a while, and we'll see the states they developed later. The knowledge of the Sigurd story never died out among the rural population of Scandinavia, so it's very much like traditional folklore that lives on forever. Don't we still tell our children fairy tales? They're still popular, to Cinderella, for example, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and all of the fairy tales that are handed down. We still tell our children those stories, the Three Little Pigs and Little Red Riding Hood, and all of those, that folklore lasts virtually forever in the knowledge of the people, especially in the countryside where they're not, being exposed to a lot of new knowledge as they would be in the city. The story of the Volsunga Saga is full of supernatural elements, schemes of the one-eyed Odin. There's a ring of power and the sword that was reforged into a super sword that was unbeatable and unbreakable. It inspired, in fact, Richard Wagner, who wrote the Ring Cycle in the 19th century, the operas, the Wagnerian operas of the Nibelungenlied. It contains historical episodes that took place in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, and memories of the German migrations from Scandinavia down into Europe and pressing on the border of the Roman Empire. And the songs of the Huns and the Goths are part of the cultural memories. The Norsemen then in Norway retained the songs of Sigurd and the Volsungs, and the prose story is based on Eddic poetry, a form of mythic or poetic lay developed before 1000. And why do you think it was developed as a lay, as a poem, rather than as a prose story? What logic can you think of that would make people write it as a poet? Both of you are
more apt to remember it and repeat it correctly.
If it's a poem, you can remember it more easily. Was that what you were going to say? Because it rhymes, then you can. It helps you remember it. So rhyming is a memory aid, so that it helps you remember it. Sure. And when you have these lays, they're called lays. Then they could rhyme it, and it has a rhythm, and you can repeat it, and it helps you remember it generation after generation. It's in the common oral folk culture of old Scandinavia, and it endures in the countryside. And here we have, I think, a map of, this is the Roman Empire at the time of Justinian, which is really in the 6th century. And here we can see the tribes as they're still wandering around pretty much. The West Gothic kingdom at this point is over here, the Suevi are here. The Frankish kingdom is here. This is Burgundy, and we're going to mention Burgundy a lot. The Burgundians are down in here. The Lombards are here. The Gepids are here. The Ostrogoths were in Italy, but now they've been displaced, so we'll go back to that in a moment. And this is the earlier Edda. This is not the poetic Edda, it's the prose Edda. So it shows the prose Edda here. And in fact, you're reading some of the Volsunga Saga. I forgot to bring our book of the Eddas, the Eddic poetry that we have. Some of it is in there, and you might recognize some of it. Okay, again, here we have the earlier Edda. Do any of these words sort of jump out at you as something that you can recognize from what you know already? Anybody? You see Viking? Where is it? Count down in the rows.
Third line, fourth word over.
Third line, 1, 2, yes, very good. Vikinga. All right, so Viking, we can recognize one word. Well, a little more practice, you can read Icelandic. Okay. And here is a map of the kingdoms, the Germanic kingdoms. As I mentioned, the kingdom of the Ostrogoths is stretched out over here. This is before Justinian, so this would be a bit earlier. And here we have the Visigothic kingdom. At this point is here. The Franks are here, and I wanted to show this map in particular because here is Burgundy, and actually at an earlier time, and I don't have the map that shows the Huns actually swept in here and were all the way in central France, and so the Huns were actually fighting with a lot of these Germanic peoples as they swept into this area, and there were battles between the Burgundians and the Huns and the Franks and the Goths, and all those names appear in the saga, interestingly, when we see all of those names in the saga. It was so popular, the Volsunga Saga was so popular that it reached Greenland because we have the Greenlandic lay of Utley, and Utley is a corruption of Attila the Hun. So Utley is a name of one of the kings described in here, and it's quite interesting that in the saga, he is not differentiated in any way from the Germanic kings, like the king of Gautland, which is Gothland, one of the Gothic kings, or any of the other kings. I mean, he is treated as an equal participant in every way, and he is not pointed out to be very different, except he's quite greedy, but then everybody else is very greedy too, so he's not any different from anyone else. The written Icelandic material builds on a long oral tradition, and in the 10th century, the Icelanders had already become renowned as storytellers, and Icelandic poets were called skalds and earned their keep in royal courts. Did you all recognize the point where Egil became a skald? Remember when he went to the court of King Harald, and he recites poems all through Egil's saga. And when he came to the court of King Harald the Shaggy, I believe it was, or was it King Eric? One of those courts, the king sat him at his right hand and said, "Oh, you're such a wonderful poet, I'll honor you over all other men." And so he became the court poet, at least for the time being. And so they're very much honored in this society. So the skalds told the Sigurd cycle just as the German poets told the story of Siegfried. And they were more or less parallel legends that grew at the same time, although they were separated by different cultures. The German version, in fact, was written down around 1200 in Austria at about the same time as the Norse version of the Volsunga Saga was written down. Iceland was an immigrant society, a frontier society on the fringes, and there they preserved the old lore probably better and more unchanged than they would have in the homeland back at home, mainly because it was a treasured link with their homeland. And so whereas the Norse would preserve it on the countryside as part of their past, the Icelanders would have this nostalgia for things from the homeland and preserve it maybe with more diligence. Writing became popular in the 13th century in Iceland before sagas were forgotten, and at that point the Volsunga Saga was written down along with a lot of other sagas. And here we have a map of the Viking world. I call this map the Viking world. Here, of course, is Scandinavia, which would be the homeland, and the sagas would be preserved in the countryside. Iceland and Greenland, but Greenland didn't last very long, but Iceland in particular lasted until the present day, and the people had this nostalgia to preserve these legends, whereas in Russia and in England and the other places the Vikings went, they tended to be more absorbed into the local culture, although elements are still there. I mean, the Siegfried saga is, pictures of Siegfried appear all over the Scandinavian world, in Russia and in England and in Iceland and in Norway. Did you have a question?
Yes, one question. Do you know if there's any parallel between Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and St. George the Dragon Slayer?
Oh, good question. Not exactly. And what's interesting is the parallels I've seen drawn are with St. Michael, interestingly. And although St. George is a dragon slayer, St. Michael is also often shown with swords, and for some reason in the northern countries and the Scandinavian countries, Saint Michael almost is interchangeable with Sigurd, and Saint Michael the Archangel becomes a very strong saint in the northern world, and I'm not clear exactly why, unless, I mean, people are speculating that they see the parallels between Saint Michael and Sigurd, but it's not that obvious to me. Anyway, there it is. St. Michael is everywhere, and he was particularly popular among the Normans. One speculation is that St. Michael became popular because Michaelmas is in the middle of autumn, the harvest time, and it corresponds to a Scandinavian harvest festival. And so this also is another parallel so that they can celebrate Michaelmas. But I know in reading the sources in England, Michaelmas is a benchmark. They sort of time everything around Michaelmas, which is St. Michael's death day, and they celebrate it in church as St. Michael's Day. Okay, and here are some of the pictures that appear all over the world, and these are Norse wood carvings. If you can see here, this is the whole story of Sigurd and the Volsunga Saga on these church doorways. And I'm going to show you these various pictures close up, but here is the whole story. Actually, interestingly, it starts down here and it goes backwards from what we would think. The story goes up like this, and then it starts down here and goes up like this to the end as we read the story, and we'll go through it in just a moment. Almost all the Viking literature that has survived is found in Icelandic manuscripts, almost all of it, and it's the largest existing vernacular literature of the medieval West. It is both myth and legend and saga and history and poetry. And let me stop for a minute. I brought a whole bunch of Viking sagas with me, and I'm going to give Penguin a lot of free publicity here because most of them are published by Penguin. This is a brand new book, and next time I teach this course I'm going to require this one, The Sagas of the Icelanders, and you can see what a hefty book it is. It has all the sagas in it, and let me just read for you some of the sagas that are in here. Ale Saga is the first one. Ale Saga is very important. Okay, the Saga of the people of Vatnsdal, the Saga of the people of Laxardal, that would be the Laxardala Saga, Boli Bolason's Tale, the Saga of Hrafnkol Fregsgodi, the Saga of the Confederates, Gisli Sursen's Saga, the Saga of Gunnlaug Serpent Tongue, the Saga of Ref the Sly, the Vinland Sagas, the Saga of the Greenlanders, Eric the Red Saga, and so just all of these various sagas. This is a wonderful book. It's a collection, and of course we have our own Ale Saga, and Penguin publishes almost all of the sagas that we're going to talk about. I'll be reading you stories from the Orkneyinga Saga later, which is the Orkney Islands to the north. We're going to read the Vinland Sagas when we do the Norse Discovery of America. Here is Hrafnkol's Saga, and this is a really great and funny story. Here's a pretty new one that Penguin's just put out, the Saga of King Hrolf Kraki, and King Harold's Saga, which we're going to talk about in a few moments. We'll talk some more about King Harold's Saga. And this is the Saga of the Volsungs, which is actually put out by the University of California in a new translation by Jesse Byack, and this is what I used for today's appraisal of the Volsunga Saga. And so this is a wonderful saga. You know, this is the same rune that I picked out that I thought it encompassed the whole world, but it could be the Volsunga Saga. That's the same rune. Well, we'll see that later. Okay, the Icelanders created the saga, and one of the most famous of the skalds is Snorri Sturluson. He wrote the Prose Edda, a 13th century treatise on the art of skaldic poetry, and what it is a handbook of mythological lore. It's a 3-part prose work The Icelanders created the saga, a prose narrative form unique in Western medieval culture, and they cultivated this form and developed it into a vehicle for long tales of epic quality. I've suggested to you that writing a saga takes a particular form. Now, I know you haven't read a lot of sagas. Has anybody read more sagas than Egil's saga? Is that the only one you've read, or has many of you read any other ones as well? Anybody read any other ones? How about in Sugarland? Have you read any other sagas? No, nobody. You have. Good.
Is Beowulf considered a saga?
No. Beowulf is a poem, but I don't think it's a saga. It's not. It's a different form. Okay, then you haven't been able to discern the saga form. Maybe after I tell you the story of the Volsunga saga, we'll see if you can discern the typical saga form. So we'll try that as a kind of puzzle for you to figure out as we go through here. Okay, at times it seems as if the Volsung author tried to make history from the mythic material. And he may have been drawing on an earlier prose saga about the Volsung, and that saga would have been the saga of Thidric of Bern. And Thidric of Bern sounds like a corruption of Theodoric, who was one of the kings of the Ostrogoths. And it was about King Theodoric the Ostrogoth, later called Dietrich of Bern. So you can see how the names are changing over time as we go to the different areas of Europe. Along with tales of Sigurd and those of historical peoples and events, the Volsunga saga recounts eerie stories dating into European prehistory. And here's an example of one. I want to read you a little bit about these kind of stories. When Sigurd's father Sigmund is driven from society by his enemy, the king of Gautland, and here that's the king of the Goths, clearly in southwestern Sweden, Sigmund finds a companion in his son Sinfjotli. Away from other humans, the two live in an underground dwelling, clothe themselves in wolf skins, and howl like wolves. Well, they do more than that, actually. They roam the forest as beasts of prey, killing any men they come upon. This section of the tale may be interpreted in light of traditions concerning some of Odin's warriors who, according to Snorri Sturluson, behaved like wolves. Okay, and they're kind of like Sigurd's kinsmen are living like werewolves, and that may also shed light on the wolf warriors. Helmets and sword scabbards were decorated with these strange figures, perhaps werewolves or berserkers, and these date from the 6th through the 8th centuries in Scandinavia. So this story may shed light on that tradition where we don't really have any historical sources on that. These stories of Sigmund and his son Sinfjotli in the forest and others like it in the saga reflect the uncertain boundaries between nature and culture and between the world of men and the world of the supernatural. The saga's frequent descriptions of crossings of these borders reveal glimpses not only of fears and dreams, but also of long-forgotten beliefs and cultic practices. Not least among these is Sigurd's tasting the blood of the dragon and thereby acquiring the ability to understand the speech of birds. The mixture of arcane knowledge and oral history in the Volsung material proved a potent lure for Norse audiences. Well, obviously, Norse audiences enjoyed it, and the reason they did is because it's a really good story. Okay, it's a very adventurous story. The story of Sigurd and the lost treasure of the Burgundians was a favorite subject for artists, and let me show you a few of the pictures. Okay, here again are the Burgundians and the Ostrogoths, the Goths who are there. There's also a Gotland here, and so they may have taken their names or a similar name there. But there are many existing wood and stone carvings of the story from Greenland to Russia, and the most frequent scenes are the reforging of the sword Gram, the killing of the dragon Fafnir, the roasting of the dragon's heart, and the birds giving advice to Sigurd. Sigurd's horse Granny was often loaded with the treasure from the hoard. And you know, the picture that I have seen most commonly, other than Sigurd slaying the dragon Fafnir, is Sigurd's brother-in-law, King Gunnar, who's bound, tied up in the snake pit and playing the harp with his toes. And I think this is a really funny image of I mean, it's kind of sad what's happening to him, but here he is playing the harp with his toes. And most of them are carvings, and they're wood carvings from Christian churches or stone crosses or baptismal fonts or portals or rune stones. And so when you see this image, you will recognize it instantly, that it's Gunnar in the snake pit. And there are so many images, and I can't imagine why that particular image was so popular. But let's look at a couple of them. I'm going to spend a few minutes having you look at these pictures, and then and then maybe we'll save the story for when we come back. Okay, here are the door panels. I've already shown you one set of door panels. This is a different set of door panels, and it has some of the same scenes. Here's the forging of the sword, forging it into it's the broken sword. He forges into a whole sword, and here he is slaying the dragon, stabbing him in the heart. This is another scene that I didn't mention, and this is when he actually kills the blacksmith this is the brother of the blacksmith who gets killed. And then he is, this is the otter skin. He turns into an otter, and then he's skinned. Okay, it's kind of gory. It's a pretty gory story here. But we'll see how that works with the story of the otter skin. Okay, and here are some close-ups. We'll look at the art before we take our break. Here's the forging of the sword, Granny, and this is the blacksmith. This must be the blacksmith here working, and then this must be Sigurd, who's helping him by... This looks like a bellows, doesn't it look like a bellows that he is, and here he's forging with blacksmith tools, which we've already seen when we looked at their tools and their material culture. Here is the testing of the sword. They're testing it against the anvil to see if it's if it's strong enough. And in this particular scene, here is the blacksmith who is bearded, and here is Sigurd testing the sword. Now here is Sigurd slaying the dragon, and he's variously called a snake and a dragon and a serpent. It's not clear whether he's a dragon or a snake or a serpent, but here he's kind of shown as a snake, and Sigurd is piercing him. Here is his head. He's actually piercing him in the shoulder so that he will hit his heart, which is how the saga describes him slaying the dragon. And then here he is down at the bottom roasting the dragon's heart and eating it. Okay, which is okay. And here is the blacksmith watching him do that, holding, of course, the sword. And then up here we see his horse Granny, who is a rather miraculous horse, and on his back is loaded the Rheingold treasure. And then here are the birds that he can now understand once he tastes the dragon's heart. Okay, he can understand the birds. Now then he turns around and he slays the blacksmith. Okay, and we'll see why he slays the blacksmith in a few moments, but he's stabbing the blacksmith. He actually cuts off his head. I don't know what these things are coming out of his mouth. What do you think they are?
Blood.
Blood? Could be. So he's slaying Regan, the blacksmith. He's wearing a typical Viking helmet, by the way, and here is Gunnar tied up. He's in the snake pit, and he's all tied up, and he's playing the harp with his toes. Okay, and images like that appear all over of him doing that. Here is the otter skin. I told you I would show you a close-up of that. Okay, the earliest carvings are in the 10th and 11th century stone crosses from the Isle of Man. And what is so interesting is all these images are on churches and crosses. The Isle of Man was a meeting place for Norse and Celtic culture, but the most numerous images from the story of the Volsungs are from the 12th and 13th century Norwegian stave churches, and those are the images I just showed you of all the images from the carvings on the church portal doors. And what is so interesting is that on these Norse churches there are few biblical scenes, but many, many of Sigurd and King Gunnar. Well, why? One speculation is because the door represents a spiritual defense of the interior, and that the door is somehow guarding the interior, and that dragon slaying is thought suitable to represent on the portals because the dragon is equated with Satan. And so Sigurd is a kind of saint. He's like St. George or St. Michael, who slays Satan and slays the dragon. So Sigurd crossed the threshold from a pagan to a Christian hero, and he becomes equated. Remember last week we talked a bit about how can we make parallels between the Viking religion and Christian religion. Well, here's another place where they take this parallel and they incorporate it into the Christian beliefs. They make it part of the Christian beliefs. And so Sigurd becomes a symbol of goodness, or Christ slaying the dragon of Satan, or slaying sin. And all of these things can be equated together. So Sigurd becomes a Christian hero, perhaps because of his dragon slaying. And here is a doorway that goes into one of those churches, and perhaps we can see the whole doorway here. And Sigurd is actually not on this doorway, but here, lo and behold, is Gunnar playing the harp with his toes from the snake pit, and there he is on the door. When I read you the story of Gunnar, we'll see if you can figure out why this is such a holy image and why it's shown everywhere. Here is that same one. I've blown it up so you can see Gunnar in the snake pit, and here are all these snakes curling around him. People are often killed in snake pits. That's how the Vikings like to kill people, throwing them in snake pits. And here he is. His hands are tied behind his back, so he has to play the harp with his toes. And here is a doorway. This is a photograph I took in Denmark. It's a doorway to a church in Denmark. What do you see on that doorway? Anything familiar? Anybody see Sigurd the Dragon Slayer on that doorway? On that door? It's a door of a church. You see it? Everybody see it? Where is Sigurd? Right there's Sigurd, and he's slaying that dragon. Okay, and there's his sword, Graham. Okay, I don't see Gunnar here. Kind of searched it, but let me show you a little bit of a close-up on that. You can see it a little better. This actually looks like a two-headed dragon, which is kind of interesting, but there's Gunnar on that church door slaying the dragon. This is a chair that was in a church, and here it is with Sigurd slaying the dragon. Did you have a comment? Well, could you press the mic? Yeah, press the mic. I'll go back one.
I was thinking that might be Gunnar, headless Gunnar up there above the dragon's head.
Above the dragon's head? Here?
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think so though. It looks like a blacksmith's tool kind of to me. Or just a decoration. I don't know exactly what it is. I mean, you know, who knows what these things are? You sort of have to puzzle them out.
And possibly the dragon's heart between the two of them.
Oh, the dragon's heart. Maybe so. It sure looks like a heart, doesn't it? That's kind of interesting. Yeah, I didn't notice that one. Well, here is Sigurd slaying the dragon or the snake. I mean, he's variously called a dragon or a snake, and here he is on the side view of a chair. And here is yet another view of Gunnar in the snake pit, and this is on the back of a chair. And look at these wonderful snakes, how interlaced they are together. Isn't that an interesting design for those snakes to be woven together? And there's Gunnar, and there's the harp down there. He's playing the harp with his toes. And then down here we have two fierce dragons that are very menacing. Okay. And here, guess what this is? This is Gunnar in the snake pit. You can see there he is with his hands tied behind his back, and there is the harp. He's playing with his toes and the snakes all around here. And here is a runic inscription across here. And what is this? It's a baptismal font. Isn't that interesting to have Gunnar in the snake pit on a baptismal font? Okay. But perhaps because of his association with the Norwegian royal house, Sigurd became extremely popular everywhere. The cult of St. Michael the Dragon Slayer developed early in Scandinavia, and we mentioned St. Michael. I mentioned him before as one of the one-to-one correspondences they make. He's often represented in Denmark on church portals, and certainly in Normandy, the cult of St. Michael was very strong. One of the most famous and the biggest and the grandest monastery in Normandy was Mont Saint-Michel, which is right on the border between Burgundy and Normandy, and it was one of the most famous monasteries, the earliest monasteries in Normandy. And the relics of St. Michael, of course there were lots of relics, but they were brought to Normandy by the Normans. Michael was a guardian angel of the Danes, the Baltic Germans, and the Ottonians, so he was very popular in the Norse. And in fact, the Norse may have chosen Sigurd over Michael for political reasons, because Sigurd's daughter Aslaug is said to have married Ragnar Lodbrok, or Ragnar Hairy Breeches, and both of them were ancestors of the Norwegian royal house. Okay, and so they were, the Norwegian royal house is said to have descended from Sigurd, and so this is why he may have become a saint, which is very interesting, I think. Okay, there are two parts to the Volsunga Saga, which I've spelled wrong here. I'm sorry, Volsunga Saga. Part 1 ends with Sigurd's arrival among the Burgundians, and Part 1 is very much more supernatural than Part 2 is. Part 1 is kind of on the background of the family and the supernatural events, the connections with the gods and so on that they're dealing with, and Part 2 is more to do with the historical events, the wars between the Goths and the Huns and all of the different people there, groups that are in that area of Europe. And here are some renditions of St. Michael. Last week I showed you a picture of a Byzantine version of St. Michael. This is an Italian version of St. Michael that is shown in Pisa. And what do we see here? What do we see in this image of St. Michael? He's got a sword. What else has he got? Anything you recognize here?
Is that a Viking helmet?
It sure looks like one, doesn't it? It's a helmet of some kind. It's quite similar to, but this is not a Viking image. This is Italian, and it's from Pisa, 13th century. Anything else you notice interesting about this particular image, though? What is he wearing? Anybody recognize the clothing he's wearing? What do you think it is?
His cloak is like a Viking, the cloak over one shoulder.
Kind of like a Viking, but some other people wore cloaks that way too. What about that little skirt he's wearing? A little hard for you. It's the uniform of a Roman soldier. So here he is. And you know, this is utterly against what early Christianity stood for. Remember that the early Christians rejected warfare and killing people. And so here we have a Roman soldier becoming the personification of a saint, which is kind of interesting. Now here is a really different image of Saint Michael. We see Saint Michael wielding a sword. He's always shown wielding a sword, but this is more of a Byzantine image. This is a French image that's later, and he's wearing these sort of French brocades. What does Saint Michael do? Does anybody familiar with what Saint Michael's role in the story of Christianity? What does he do?
He helped defeat Satan and the angels who were rebelling against God.
Right, the rebellious angels. And does anybody know how he's often shown in medieval art, where he appears most often? How he's often portrayed in medieval art. I've shown you some images of Saint Michael by himself. I searched all over today and I couldn't find the picture I wanted that shows a more typical scene that he's in.
Isn't he usually shown like standing on a devil?
Sometimes he is, yeah, he's shown standing on a devil, but he's often shown like in the tympanum of a Gothic church. And what is he doing? You're shaking your head, yes?
Well, I'm not sure, but I've seen some pictures. Usually he's coming down from somewhere. Looks like in the midst of a battlefield, somebody just dying. I don't know if that's the same.
Yes, because on the tympanum of a church, very often it'll portray the last judgment day, and very often it will show Christ in the very center, and on Christ's right will be the souls who are saved and who are going to heaven, and all the good people are shown on his right, and then on his left hand will be all the souls who are going to hell. And usually they're shown in various positions of torture and death and dying and suffering in some way. And St. Michael is usually there weighing their souls, and it's St. Michael who determines who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. Perhaps because he's the one who slew all the rebellious angels. So he's the one who decides which souls go to heaven and which ones go to hell. And he's often shown with a scale weighing their souls. So this is an interesting role for him. Yeah. You didn't have a comment. Okay. Okay. The first part is full of mythic motifs, supernatural beings, gods, giants, a valkyrie, a dwarf, a dragon, and there's also some valuable information about Odin, the one-eyed god of war, wisdom, death, and ecstasy. And Odin is an ancestor and patron of the Volsung line, and he's the one who provides a magical sword to Sigurd's father, Sigmund. And he tells Sigurd how to identify his horse, Granny, a descendant of Sleipnir. Okay, who is Sleipnir again? Anybody remember who Sleipnir is?
Odin's horse?
Odin's horse, yeah. So Granny, his own, Sigurd's own horse, is a descendant of Sleipnir. And Odin intervenes at crucial moments. And let's look at this description of Odin intervening. This is just one example of Odin intervening, but there are quite a number of them. Okay. Thus, when the marriage bed of Sigurd's great-grandfather, King Rerir, is barren, Odin sends Rerir an apple of fertility. The token is carried by a wish maiden, one of Odin's supernatural women, who flies in the guise of a crow, a carrion bird similar to Odin's ravens. This divine intervention results in the miraculous birth of King Volsung. And later, Volsung further reinforces the progenital link with the god by marrying the wish maiden who brought the apple that precipitated his own birth. The implied incestuousness of this marriage is echoed later in the saga by the sexual union of Volsung's twin children, Sigmund and Signy. Volsung has an additional connection with fertility cults. His name corresponds to an Old Norse fertility god called Volsi, whom Norwegian peasants represent as a deified horse phallus in the tale of Volsi. Okay, so it goes back. I mean, it goes back both backward and forward. It reaches back into pagan myth of the Vikings, and it reaches forward into Christianity. Odin and Loki then set in motion events that bring great treasure from the world of the dwarves to the world of men, and the treasure carries a curse, a link to the second or human part of the story. Okay, and here are some of the monsters that are shown, the otherworldly beasts. What do you think this is? Can anybody figure out what these animals are? They don't look like real animals to me, but then maybe I'm not interpreting them right. But what do they look like to you? Any ideas? They're hard to tell, aren't they? What does this one look like? This looks like sort of eagle's claws, doesn't it? But they're upside down. And then he's got a serpent's kind of mouth, but he's got forelegs too, even though these are up here. So they're otherworldly beasts and sort of wild things. And here is another scene that possibly comes from this story as well. This is a woman between two men, and this man is holding a ring. So this might possibly be one of the scenes from the story, and there's a love triangle here. Actually, it's more of a quadrangle than a triangle, but sort of a triangle. And so here she is. This might be Brunhild accepting the ring from Sigurd, or it might be Gunnar accepting the ring from Sigurd. And then this is her brother, Gunnar's brother, whose name I've forgotten at the moment, who may be the third one in the triangle. This carving may be explained by two different interpretations. The woman between the two horsemen may be Brunhild, and the ring, that which the gods got from the dwarf Andvari for a ransom for otter, and which he predicted would always bring misfortune to its owner. Or she may be Gudrun, confiding to the messenger of Utley a ring, warning Gunnar and Hogni of their danger. Okay, and here is the horse Granny, close up with the treasure on his back, and here are the two birds that then whisper, well, they're actually four birds that whisper to Sigurd. Okay, at this point, well, I don't want to start reading the story until we get to, I'll just go ahead with the summary of the story, and then I'll do the whole thing when we get back. Sigurd then bathes in the blood of the dragon and becomes invulnerable to weapons. And he's sort of like Achilles, one part vulnerable. Who else is he like? Besides Achilles, who else gets invulnerable protection? You remember anybody?
Balder?
Right, Balder. Remember?
Biblical Samson.
Samson, yes. That's good. Balder does, but so does Samson. So we have another parallel that we could make. And Achilles. So one little part is vulnerable. And in fact, Sigurd's memorable deed of slaying the dragon causes tragedy. He also has the power of shape changing, so he can change his shape from one thing to another. And he's not the only one who can shape change. A lot of the characters in here change their shape and assume in the supernatural way, assume the identity or the shape of others. Part 2 then takes place in a human world, and there's an overriding theme of tension between marriage bonds and blood bonds. There is strife with the kin by marriage that brings a series of misfortunes. Marriage creates new kinship alliances which are vital by survival, but what you really get in this period is the idea of chaos. There's no central order, and there is the only thing that keeps order in the world is the kinship ties that you have, your blood ties. And then what other kinship ties do you have? You have the ties with your in-laws. Sometimes there are blood brothers that have ties together. Another kind of tie that the Scandinavians have is fostering. So you have foster brothers, foster fathers, foster children, foster daughters, foster mothers, and all of that appears in this saga as well. So there's only a rudimentary judiciary, and the blood feud is everywhere. Every time somebody gets killed or wronged, it sets in motion a terrible feud, and that's why this story is a great tragedy. In fact, in this story, everybody dies. And one of the most interesting things about it is very early in the saga when I believe it's not Sigurd, I think it's his father Sigmund, who is leading all of his 10 sons into a doomed, hopeless battle with one of the kings, their rivals. And his daughter, Signy, tells him, "Don't fight, it's a trap. My husband has set a trap for you. He plans to kill you, father, and all my brothers, your sons. And go home. Don't stay here and fight." And the king replies, her father replies, "No Viking ever fled from a fight. And we all must die. Everybody has to die. That's the big danger in life. But we all have to face it, and we're going to face it with bravery." There is no practical caution here, which we see much later in the Viking wisdom literature, that you should watch out for your enemies. But he just goes foolishly into the battle, and he and all his sons are killed except for Sigmund. But he says this sort of fatalistic Viking thing, that we all have to face the fact that we all die, and so why not sooner than later, which is a pretty dreadful kind of idea, but that's the way he's seeing the whole thing. Okay, and so here he is roasting the dragon's heart. We can see in this close-up, he's got the dragon's heart, he's roasting it over a fire, and he's tasting the heart. Pledges are retained between lord and retainer, but the most trustworthy defense is the family. And again, that's where the blood feud comes in, because if your kin, if your brother or your father gets killed, you have to take vengeance. And this is, the whole story is about vengeance, revenging the death of someone. And it happens so tragically over and over and over again, because every time someone takes vengeance and kills someone to get revenge, then somebody else has to kill their family to get revenge against them. So it's a great tragedy in the end. As I said, everybody dies. But the Volsungs seldom have dependable blood relationships, and the other thing that you see in this story is time after time, brother betraying brother. Not only betraying brothers, but drinking their blood. I mean, you see real terrible betrayals of a person's own family, and certainly if those ties are not reliable, how about the ties with your brothers-in-law and your kindred? And so people turning against each other, the human emotions run rampant in here. Sigurd breaks the tradition of the outside bride brought to the groom's family, and Sigurd lives with his Burgundian wife's family. His brothers-in-law plot against him, even though they are blood brothers. And so, while they're blood brothers, they can work together for a while, but when push comes to shove, his brothers-in-law will turn against him and plot against him. There's a recurring pattern of strife among in-laws, and even among relatives. There will be among relatives. And we see fratricide, we see infanticide in this story, we see incest, just about everything that goes with a pretty lawless society here. There are historical aspects. There's a Scandinavian origin for the Burgundians, which is possible, and it's logical. The Huns and Attila appear here clearly. There's a king of Hunland and Attila, who is Atli in the Volsunga saga, and they certainly existed. And here we see all of these barbarians who existed. There's a Gautland, which might be the Ostrogoths. The Burgundians are up here. Later they end up down here. The Goths almost certainly originated in southern Scandinavia and migrated across the Baltic. The saga's account is far from historically accurate, but some episodes have a foundation in history. For example, Attila's death at the hand of a woman echoes Jordanus, which also happened at the hand of a woman. And actually, Jesse Byock in this quotes one of several stories about Attila the Hun. One story is that he dies of drunkenness on his wedding night, and he just sort of dies of drunkenness on his bed. The other story is that he dies in the midst of marrying yet another wife out of the many that he has on his marriage night. So the stories vary, but they all say that this is what happens. Well, why don't we stop about here, and then when we come back from our break, I'd like to go through the whole story in much more detail, and there's a lot of interesting detail in here that connects with the social history we've seen and with the religious history we've seen. And in fact, every time you recognize something, I want you to raise your hand and tell me what it is. But let's take our break for about 15 minutes, and unless you have any comments, we still have a couple of minutes left. Any comments or questions about this saga? Yeah.
Were they a bit more fatalistic when they went to war and they were less afraid of dying because they wanted to go to Valhalla? Wasn't the only way for them to get there if they were
I don't
if they
think
died
they
in
had
battle?
that mentality. I mean, it wasn't that they wanted to go to Valhalla, or at least it's not represented in the saga as wanting to go to Valhalla, that somehow the afterlife is better than this life. It's more fatalistic, like, we've all got to die sometime, why not now? And that's almost what he says. I found it rather shocking, and especially, I mean, he was kind of old at that time, but his sons were all very young, and for him to feel that way, I found it surprising. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? But there was no mention of Valhalla, no thought of Valhalla. There's one point where Sigurd thinks no, it's not Sigurd. Is it Sigurd or is it his father, Sigmund? I think it's Sigmund, who at a certain point, he says, my luck has run out. I've been really lucky up to this point, but there's a certain point when he knows his luck has run out and he's going to die. And he really doesn't want to live anymore. We have a couple suicides in here too, which is interesting. Brunhild at the end commits suicide because life has become unbearable for her. The horrible dilemma, the tragedy that she finds herself caught in is so horrible she doesn't want to live anymore. So it's a much different attitude toward death than we find in Christianity or in our culture. That there are times, and in fact, when Sigmund dies, he wants to die. He says, my luck is gone. I'm going to die, and that's fine, Because who wants to live if you don't have luck anymore? So, any other comments or questions? Okay, when we come back, we'll go through it in some detail, and I'll try to sort of go through it very quickly and tell you the story with the pictures on the screen, and then we'll look at a couple of other elements of the Viking sagas. But I kind of wanted to go through it in some detail for you, so you'd at least have two sagas to compare, and you can compare this with Egil's saga, and we can discuss it a little bit. So let's go ahead and take about a 15-minute break, and we'll come back and do this saga more thoroughly.